All right, everyone, we are here. Hopefully you've got the emails bouncing around about what we are doing, kind of where we're going from here. And I will also talk about final today. So what we are going to focus on primarily today is your midterm. I am pulling it up now. I hope all of you have your midterm or are prepared with notes to write things down so that we can discuss it. Don't want to grade. Do you see anything grading? Nope, don't want to do that. Shit. All right. I have the midterm pulled up and we're going to go through it together. I also have with me a copy of 3 redacted midterms from last semester, all of who scored 100. 2 are CJ majors. 1 is not. 2 are we'll get to that first thing on Wednesday. Read out to treat it. I'll get that one. All right. So what I was saying, I have 3 examples that we will kind of be basing off of. I will say this to whoever said I think I did mine wrong, because everyone else said there's 1 to 2 pages and mine was 5 to 6. You're on the right track. The shortest paper that got a 100 was 7 pages. The other 2 exemplary papers are 14 pages. So when I say I want an essay, I want an essay. Let's talk through what some of the answers are for this. Did anyone answer question 1 of the short answer? Explain what Jeffrey Robinson meant when he discussed the difference between the law and the living in Who We Are, Chronicles of Racism. Actually, pause. Did you guys watch that documentary? All right, okay, so that's the reason none of you know how to answer that question. I'm assuming none of you then answered it, right? Okay, so to quickly explain the difference between the law and living, what Jeffrey Robinson was talking about, does anyone know that person's name is? He's a lawyer he is a very, very famous lawyer from Memphis who produced this documentary and is now available on Netflix. I do encourage you to watch it. A lot of what we would have talked about through New Jim Crow in detail is covered in summary in that movie, or excuse me, in that film. So I highly recommend it if you kind of want to go back and just have a little more context and a little more knowledge for that. So what he was talking about though is, the point of the film is to explore how essentially slavery and racism are built into our legal structure. They aren't just byproducts of, and they aren't just perpetuated by people who have bias or prejudice or racist thinking. They are literally built as institutions to do that. And so he walks through a lot of the law that shaped the founding country. So he walks through a lot of the Constitution. And he walks through a lot of early law. He walks through the slave trade and the changes with that, all the way up into like housing discrimination, which is where his personal story comes in. He lived here in Memphis during a time in which the utility company, I believe it was whatever the former version of MLGW was trying to buy up a bunch of properties. Maybe another developer, can't remember. Some developer was trying to buy up a bunch of properties in this area that were cheap. And a lot of people in that community were of color. And because many of them did not have access to generational wealth or generational education, which is a form of generational wealth, they didn't know to kind of hold out. They just took the quickest cash offer and went and moved to another neighborhood. Jeffrey's father was an educated man, and he said, I know better. I know that if you want my property, you're going to have to offer it. And I don't want something that's just in another neighborhood. I want something better for my kids. I want my kids to be able to attend the best school district, which they didn't have time. So he said, I will sell you my house, but you have to buy me a house in this area. And they said, cool, we'll work with that. Problem was, when he went to do all of that, or his father went to do all of that, he kept getting told no. There were no houses available, real estate market or real estate agents would just not show up at showings. Strange things were happening. So his father and the family friends who were white and a part of the Jewish community who lived nearby decided to essentially buy the house for them. So they went to the showing, they bought the house, and then they traded it, or they did another residential transaction and sold the property to Jeffrey's parents for $1. Which all lawyers know is just like, we did this because we had to. So he got into that district. There was a lot of pushback about him and his family's presence. But he talked about how being in that position as a young Black man then elevated him to get ready for his trajectory into law school and then to work in civil rights. And a lot of the time in the documentary, he spends time talking about how the law says one thing. For instance, what does the 13th Amendment? We're all very familiar with it. We talked a little bit about it before. It outlaws slavery, right? That's what we're all familiar with the 13th Amendment, right? That's the law. But the difference between the law and the living is the lived experience of those of us who fall outside of the law. So for those of us who have committed a criminal offense, does slavery exist in America?
Yes.
Yes. That's the difference between the law and living. The law says no such thing as slavery. This is a free state. Those of us living outside of that and living in the real world know that's not true. They can take your humanity, they can take your freedom, they can take your money, they can take your kids, they can take anything if you've committed a crime. And who defines what a crime is? The same agency that told you that, or the same government body that told you there's no such thing as slavery. So therein lies the difference between the law and living. It's basically the lived experience of those specifically people who belong to minority populations, persons of color, persons with disabilities, LGBTQIA+ community, generally anyone living kind of in the margins on some level. You're not a part of the majority. That law is for you. That was built for you. That was built for everybody who lives in the majority, who controls that, who controls those powers. That's the law. They get the privilege of the law. The rest of us know what it is to live. We know what the law says, and we know what we have to do in order to not go afoul of the law. Now, someone tell me what I just said. Repeat it to me in language that you all understand, how you understood it. And remember, no one volunteers. I will call you. Yes.
Basically, what you just stated is that the law and the people that are living don't talk the same language to each other. So the law is set in stone, but the living still do as they please without abiding by that set law.
Or they may choose to abide by that set law. Whatever they're trying to do, it wasn't written for them. Maybe they try to live by the law, but the reality will be that the law wasn't written for them and will not come to protect them should they fall outside. The difference between the law and the living. Any questions? I recommend that documentary.
It's not like do as I say, not as I do.
It is the government version of do as I say, not as I do. The government, right, is to sit in its ivory towers, the White House, the Capitol building, the Supreme Court, and tell us what the law is. But when they go home, do you think that they're living the same exact law that they just preached on whatever podium they sit on? Right? Exactly. It is very much a government. So do as I say, not as I do. Very much the way your parents teach you when you're trying to like figure out as a young adult what you should and shouldn't do. And you're like, hey, will you drink? Do as I say, not as I do. Right? That's the difference between the law. The law is no drinking underage, no drinking. Mom drinks. As I say, not as I do. Very, very great. Great way to sum that up. And then I asked to provide examples. There are a couple of examples that he mentions in the documentary. I would have just been looking for all those that were specifically mentioned. Usually when I get to write examples, I want at least 2. Sometimes I'll be specific and ask for more, but if I say examples, I better give me one of them in an essay. All right, number 2, one of my, the shortest of the 100 papers answers this question. So, explain the difference between a social class and a social caste. This matters because we get into it in New Jim Crow. We tend to think that we have what's called the class system. What's class? What's one social class? Yes.
History, family history.
It's just what the dollar sign means. But yeah. So that's what makes up our social class now, right? And most of us tend to think, what else is true about social class?
It's not to one.
In theory, right? We all know that in theory, but how many people are people of color at the upper class? And I'm talking about the 1%. So in theory, it's not specific to a group, but how many of the people at 1% look like a male version of me? If not, right? So in theory, social class is these things. Now, we don't believe, and sorry, let's pick back a second. In this country, do we usually talk about what social class we belong to? Okay, you're right, it is so long. Do we all know what social class we belong to? Yes, generally, right? Whether we're low income, poverty, or we are working class, or upper working class, and now they've divided up into a million different things, so you can feel better about how poor you are. Upper working class, middle working class, upper middle class, and then there's just the 1%. There's no one else, right? So we think of that, we talk about that, and we typically do that in terms mostly of the money that we make, but sometimes the occupation and education usually is what we kind of talk about. So for me, I would belong to the, I would say upper working class, maybe lower middle class, somewhere in there, because I have a household that earns, the two of us, certain dollar amount. That's what the government says is that class, right? And can I change that? Can I change my social class? Can I change how much money I make? I can change my occupation, right? And I can get more education, right? And really, I can choose family. I do that all the time. Biological ones, they shit for me. Right? And for some people, that's also true. You can choose your family. Or you can just choose the people you associate with, right? Freely choose. Who's familiar with what a caste system is? Take it away. What's a caste system? It is usually based in religion. This is a big key difference. It is usually based in religious ideologies. What else is true about a caste?
Rooted in as well as deep roots in science.
You're talking, there is some like caste in the science of the way we catalog species, so you're not actually off, but in the social system. But go ahead.
Tradition.
Yes, it has very specific customs and traditions for each caste, excuse me. Do we have customs and traditions for each class? Not really, right? Other than the wealthy people who own a lot of boats, right? Seem to, I don't know. But that's not really the case, but they have specific traditions. And you can move up and down through them. Can you do that in a caste? No mobility. Yes, you have your hand up, Mr. Jess. Yes, no mobility. Born into it. And you cannot change it whatsoever. So these would be the key things that I'm looking for and explain the differences between a social class and a social caste. We typically believe in the United States, or we acknowledge at least, that we function by a social class. What is argued in the new Jim Crow is what we actually have is a caste system. And we've just removed the religion and instead used race. We've created a racial caste system that people of color or other minorities, other people with disabilities, and again, marginalized people, generally speaking, cannot move. They are born into it. It's based on their history and their family. Sometimes it's genetic, sometimes it's not. If we're talking about people who have disabilities or chronic illnesses, but certainly if we're talking about people of racial backgrounds and racial diversity, racially diverse backgrounds. Words are still hard. I didn't talk for like 6 straight weeks, guys. I pretty much just slept, so hard. And there aren't specific customs and we have specific customs and traditions that that we kind of like, at least on maybe a neighborhood level, or the people that we are around with, we share some things in common with them and what we might do on a daily basis. And in America, can you easily move classes? In theory, right? I can change my occupation, I can change my education, I can get more money. But what about for people in the racial caste system? How easy is it for them? How easy is it for a young Black man who is born to parents, one who is incarcerated, one is a single mother, and has multiple siblings? How easy is it for that individual to move from his class or caste in this country? Very difficult, right? Very difficult. Doesn't mean it's impossible. Doesn't mean that it doesn't necessarily mean anything is true about that person. That's another thing with caste, and it definitely is rated in religion, is that there is something about the person that is the problem. That's why they can't move up. In Indian cultures, if I'm wrong, there's certain class of individuals who can be untouchables. Literally what they are called. They will never be able to leave that. It is based on the idea that because of this family's history, because of their low commitment to religion, or whatever reason, they are untouchable. They are the problem. We see that here in America? Yes. Your answer is on the rest of the page. It is number 6. So in the caste in other countries, might be called an untouchable. Here, Michelle Alexander argues the criminal Black man. And we'll talk a little bit more about what that means and what that represents, but it is essentially what we think of when we think of a criminal or a criminal Black man who's a criminal, whatever, however you want to phrase those 3 words. That's what we think of. They're untouchable. They can't change their class. And a lot of times those are structures that are built in. I'll get you in a second. But those are structures that are built in, right? Because the other questions ask you, what happens when you enter a guilty plea? What happens when you're incarcerated? Are you a citizen when you're incarcerated? No. You are a slave. You are a slave to the state. You cannot vote. What happens when you leave? You just fled, or you don't even go to prison. You don't even go to prison. You just plead guilty. What do you give up? Many of your rights. Many that will affect you for the rest of your life. So if you've given up those rights, which will ultimately affect how much money you can make, your educational opportunities, your employment opportunities, can you leave? Can you leave? So that's kind of what Michelle Alexander explores in her early part of the book, is the fact that we keep calling the United States a class system, a class-based system, where if you just work hard enough, right? If you just pull yourself up by your bootstraps, you too can become a Vanderbilt or a Carnegie. I've been working my ass off since I was like 15 to get into college so I could get a scholarship, so that I could go to school for free, and then get into graduate assistantship so I could go to graduate school for free, and then work my ass off at those 2 things just so I could get half or like a third of law school paid for, just so that Joe Biden could tell me years later that he's not going to pay for it like he promised he would. And I did all of that while having cancer, having to have hysterectomies, having to have multiple surgeries, and I was able to barely leave poverty and get into working middle class. And if I was on my own, I wouldn't be able to. Thankfully, I married the man down the hall because he makes more money than me. And because we share a household, I'm in a different class. If I did not share a household or get married to that person, I would still be in the same working class that my mom started out in. Actually, my mom was in poverty because she had 5 children in her house. But if you just had herself, she would have been in working class. I would still be working. The only reason I'm not is because I'm married. If you think marriage is not a privilege, you are absolutely freaking wrong. It gives you a whole host of abilities that you would not have had if you are just a single person, like the access to a second bank account when you overdraft yours. Just being funny. Anyway, so that's the idea that we're forming on, is that the United States actually does function as a racial caste system, whether or not we want to acknowledge it. Yes, ma'am.
Like when I looked it up to see like the difference in good and like more about it. I think it was the New York Times magazine that described the passage as two important issues, like raise human value in this.
Yes, it is. They are making it very clear in other countries, especially where religion is used to create the caste system, that it is very artificially constructed based on, again, how you perform according to your religion or according to what you're supposed to be doing in that society. And those things specifically have limits. No one outside of the untouchable class can talk to those people, can touch those people, can interact with those people. And I think it's really what you just said, is that we have said we didn't create this because this is all choice and we have freedom here. But as Jeffrey talked about in his, in the film, Racism, A Chronicle of Who We Are, and how these were literally built into the country, like built into law, the difference between law and living. We have artificially created it and given limits, right? Just like you just said, given them limits with things you cannot do once you transgress in this way. And you permanently belong to that member of that class. Especially if it's a crime, right? You permanently belong to that class as a felon. Okay? Yes.
Dog have I'm not trying to compare anybody's experiences, but can you also say that the US and the past system?
Oh, 100%.
Seeing in how
Absolutely. And I really think that that's probably why we're seeing more headway with general movements of reform, is because, and this has been true for since the dawn of the United States, we continue to act in a way that will disparage and act according to the racial caste system. It will stay this way. It will stay this way. It will stay this way until money becomes a bigger problem. And then when poor white people start realizing that they're also in the bottom of the caste and that there's no way for them to get out, that's when we see change. Because then we build allies. We build allies with other people who are different races, who are in different communities. So we didn't used to have the ability to connect movements like Black Lives Matter with women's rights, right? We didn't have the ability to do that. We didn't have social media. Everything had to be in print form. Now everybody can be connected. So we see all of these groups that are at the bottom of the caste system. And now we're all realizing, we're all freaking stuck here. Maybe we should overhaul this. And that's when we really see movement happening. We see that with the French Revolution. We saw that with the Civil Rights Movement, because it coincided with women's rights movement. So anytime we have that coincidence of more than one group petitioning to get out of the bottom of their social class, yes, I think we're more effective. And I would absolutely agree that we're moving into a financial caste system. But you also can't disentangle financial caste from race caste, because what is also true if you belong to a race that is not white? What is true about your income? Significantly lower. How much do I make for every dollar that my spouse makes? 70-something, right? Somewhere in that ballpark. How much does a Black man make for every cent that night or every dollar that my husband makes? Less than that. How much does a Black woman make, or a Latinx woman, any woman of color actually, to every dollar that my spouse makes? 66 cents. We can't, it's very hard to disentangle what is financial reality from what is racial reality. Very, very difficult. Does that mean we can't do it? No. It also means that those two things are so intricately linked as far as in the living, right? That it becomes almost like being the law to separate them, saying like, well, it's not racial or it's just a financial caste system, when it just so happens that it looks almost identical if we call it a financial caste system or a racial caste system. A great point. They are very, very connected. Any other questions on this one before we move on? So those were the things I was hoping to see. Really, I wanted you to tell me the biggest difference is that caste is based somehow on religion or some immutable characteristic, that there's usually a lower person that cannot, and the biggest thing is that you cannot move. There's no mobility. You are born into it. That's the biggest difference that we use by definition. And again, Michelle Alexander argues these aren't real. We have a real caste system, or we have a racial caste system, not a class system in the United States. No matter how much we may tell ourselves otherwise. All right, next one. Name and describe 3 philosophies of race relation in the post-redemption era. I don't think any of them did, but we'll just skip that one. Unless anyone has it and then email me, we'll go through it together. A lot of them did 4. Because we had, did you guys read how to be an ethical prosecutor or can I be an ethical prosecutor? So this reading, I should just assume the answer is no, right? Okay, all right. So this particular reading, I slip it into a section. So there's a chapter in New Jim Crow that specifically talks about prosecutors and how they contribute to the war on drugs. So I slip in an extra reading from a Harvard journal. Harvard Law Review published this article. It's posted on Canvas, so if you want to read it, it's still there. Called "Can a prosecutor ever be ethical? Is there such thing as an ethical?" And essentially, the argument being made is that prosecutors have a dual and an inherently conflicted role. On the one hand, they are sworn. This is actually, prosecutors take a different oath of ethics than all other lawyers. You also have to swear to different things when you are signed in or when you are sworn in as a prosecutor, to different things than all other lawyers. They have higher ethical responsibilities than any other practicing lawyer. If you are a prosecutor, now if you leave the prosecutor's office, or out of the prosecutor. But if you're still actively a prosecutor, you have special duties and responsibilities. First and foremost of them is to see that justice is done. What does that mean? What does it mean to say that we've seen justice is done? Jennifer also got the match, the note we all sent out today. Y'all didn't, sorry about it. What is it? That's it.
So it's like, it's gotta be a combination of serving society by making the person did maybe routine justice, punishment or like reconciliation, but then also having justice of some enemies, not prosecuting them.
Correct.
To get someone off the street and get someone off your back, like you gotta prosecute the person. I'm not sure he did. You gotta be.
What it means to do justice, as far as the prosecutor is concerned, is to hold both of those things equally. It is not to say, I am what you might hear many people who run for district attorneys say, I am here for victims. I'm about victims. I'm going to support the victim. And that's what I'm here to do. Your ethical obligation that you swore to when you took the bar and when you became a prosecutor says, no, that is not your only job. Your other job is to make sure that people who are incarcerated, people who are accused, are also getting their fairly rewarded. It is not enough that they have defense attorneys who are there for them to advocate for them. In fact, it is not enough at all. We'll give them a free attorney, and we still want you to make sure that you are not doing anything that causes injustice. That means we want to make sure that you're not applying charges in a discriminatory way, that you're not abusing plea negotiations in an inappropriate way, that you aren't saying inappropriate things during jury selection to try to sway the jury to your side or to get an all-white jury, as some prosecutors in the past have done. That's not your job. Your job is not to get a conviction. At the same time, what's the reality? So that's the law, right? That's the law. Now what's the living? What do prosecutors do in real life? Get conviction. That's what they get up and talk about. Every time you see him on the news, we're gonna get this conviction. Go get him. Go look at him. Right? Every time. Do you ever hear them get up and say, we know this is a tragedy. And it's really awful. So truly awful that this happened in our community. We don't want to jump to any conclusions about what may or may not have happened. So we're gonna avoid speaking on the matter until everyone has that opportunity to hear. What have you ever heard of? But aren't people supposed to be innocent and proven guilty? Aren't prosecutors supposed to be there to prove justice? Aren't they supposed to be doing a double check on whether or not that the police have fully done their job within the confines of the Fourth Amendment, the Fifth Amendment? Aren't they supposed to also make sure that there's no such thing as cruel and unusual punishment? Which means that if they know things in the jail are happening, like people are getting stabbed, how many people have died in the jail this year in Memphis, Tennessee alone? Huh? No, that would be an astronomical number, and we would all be fucking. We should all still be there because it's 50.
I was like, there's been at least 2 or 3 in the last couple of weeks.
Exactly. there have been 50 deaths in custody this year. That is unheard of. And a prosecutor would normally be like, excuse me, you're not supposed to be in charge of keeping these individuals safe. And 50 of them have died on your watch. And Steve Leroy did finally say, I'm going to charge you all. This is ridiculous. People can't keep dying on your watch. And then we heard critics of Steve Leroy, who was the mayoral candidate, who was formerly sheriff. Bonner, thank you. Bonner goes on and says that the entire reason those prosecutions are even happening is because he is running for mayor. So he makes an accusation that a prosecutor who was trying to do justice for people who were murdered while in custody, he is now accused of faking prosecutions just because somebody else was running for office. So the difference between the law and the living is real for prosecutors. Their push to get convictions, to make sure the public is safe, is so overpowering that the Harvard Journal considers whether or not you can actually be ethical considering all that pressure and considering the leeway that the Supreme Court gives you. Michelle Alexander spends a lot of time going through that section in her book on what prosecutors are and aren't allowed to do, especially a lot with jury trials, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in a minute. But so I really wanted more of your opinion, having read that piece, on whether or not you think that given those kind of differentials, given those two opposing things, what the law says prosecutors are supposed to do and what the living requires of prosecutors, meaning what the public, what do we want to see from prosecutors, right? Everybody wants to see to be tough on crime. Everybody wants to see arrests happen. Everybody wants to see crime go down. They don't want to see bail reform. How many people have read Daily Memphian comments about bail reform, about how we should not be doing this? A lot of them. There are a lot of comments about how we should not be doing bail reform. Does anyone know that bail reform mandate comes from the Supreme Court or the higher appellate courts who have seen how bail has been used across the country to keep people who are poor in custody longer and make sure they go to prison or plea out? That's what it is to consider whether or not you're an ethical prosecutor. Are you moving cases fast enough? Are you responding to these inquiries? Are you making sure that your recommendations are based on the facts in the case and the defendant and not public pressure? So the article comes down on the side of no, a person cannot be an ethical prosecutor. It is not possible because of the duality. I want to know if you think so, but I want you to give me specific examples of how you can choose to be an ethical prosecutor if you think that that's still possible. And I will say that there were people who answered that, yes, I still believe people can be ethical prosecutors, and they got full credit on that question. So I don't want you to think that just because the article comes down on no, it can't happen because these things are too opposing, doesn't mean that's the reality. It also doesn't mean that's your opinion. I want to hear your opinion, but I want you to back it up with examples. Like, for instance, if a prosecutor is getting pressure to get a conviction that they don't believe exists, they might not get a promotion by dismissing the case, but they did the ethical thing. That's how you can do it. You may not get very far as a prosecutor, meaning you may not become a judge at some point because you didn't make people happy, but you can still be ethical. So I just want you to know, there's a way to answer about that question, both yes and no, but based on that article. All right, this one, it should be a little bit easier. List and describe the collateral consequences, at least 3 collateral consequences of a guilty plea, and how they affect individuals as they attempt to re-enter society. So somebody just shout at me, a couple people. I'm going to hamstring Abdullah. His names are too many today. Sorry about it. No one else is named today, so you're the only one that has been benched for the time being. Everybody else? Answer. At least give me some, at least 3, but we can give out more. 3 collateral consequences for good. Yes, ma'am.
The loss of physical body, loss of ability.
Yes, you no longer can get food stamps. You no longer apply for federal housing. You can't live in any of those places that are poor, low-income people. You can't get food stamps for your kids. All of that government assistance is gone. What does it mean to have your civil rights revoked? What does that mean?
Your right to vote.
Yes.
Your right to get your.
Yes, your right to be a juror, your right to carry a gun, your right to vote. What else? Right to pay a license.
So this TikTok, I should have sent it to you, but it was a guy questioning about this.
Then you good. Yep. Can't rent a home.
Sometimes they can be eligible to be going to certain place
You can't be employed at certain places.
I was gonna say jobs.
What were you gonna say, Tim?
It was a guy questioning about paying taxes, like why do felons have to pay taxes if they don't have the right to vote, then
Right?
they don't have representation.
No taxpayers have everything, but you have to, right? Other people don't have to pay taxes. If you make a lot of money, for example, you don't have to pay taxes. What an interesting novel concept we come up with here. Other, employment restrictions, travel restrictions. Can you get a passport? Which is funny, because we also have certain countries that have no extradition, so if you are able to go to another country where they don't need to extradite to the United States, you can stay there forever. And run away from that crime, yes.
Also, with the government funds, like, you know. We get other. We won't get it, so. There's like insurance and stuff like that,
Correct.
medical insurance.
Any government service is now not, you do not get, you do not get. Also, no Second Amendment for you. So if you want to defend yourself, even in your own home, where it never leaves, you are committing a crime. How does that generally affect your ability to enter society successfully? Yes, Jennifer.
It makes it almost impossible. One thing that, Shelley tells your office was about is if you do make it through all of that, they can still garnish your wages, for fines and fees.
Absolutely. So let's assume you actually made it out, got a job against all odds, you're working, you're getting a paycheck. The government is not satisfied with that. They are now going to take all the court fees that you didn't pay when you were before out of your check. Before you get any of it. You don't know how much book you got. Jennifer,
Hundreds.
between $300 and $1,000. At least. Huh? It also depends on the level of felony. Your court costs. So court costs will be lower on a misdemeanor, it'll be higher on a murder.
Didn't the DA here make an announcement that they were trying to work with vote?
Yes, he did. He made a statement, as have other places in reformist jurisdictions where people have said, court costs charged to the defendant are BS, especially if they have a public defender. How are they going to pay that back? Therefore, if you qualify for a public defender, your court costs are waived. In Missouri, we started doing that during my last year of practice. It was just, judges were getting mad that all the defendants were getting off probation or parole because POs were holding on to them for not paying court costs. And they were like, they had a public defender. How are they gonna do? They couldn't afford an attorney. How are they gonna afford this? So they would just start waiving court costs. If the public defender was on the case, on their own volition, and then it became law. So if you got a public defender, if you were eligible for a public defender, all your court costs are waived, except for the only one you can't statutorily waive, which is, does anybody know? Your contribution to victim comp. Every defendant who is charged in a state contributes to the victim's compensation. Again, the amount varies by level of felony or level of offense. I think it's a misdemeanor, it's like $50. In Missouri, it's like a C felony, it's like $64. Or it's like 120 if it was, so that's the only one that the judges can't waive. Anything else they can. So yeah, it makes it impossible. If you can't get education, you get a job. No, if you can't get a job, you have money. No, you don't have money. Can you do anything to like give yourself a home, feed yourself? And what if you have children? What are you gonna do with that? How are you gonna help them? If you don't have any of those things, is there another option for you other than going back into the criminal justice? Maybe, might take a really long time to find one. But that's generally the point, is that with all of those combinations of collateral consequences, I only asked you to name 3, but obviously we've named many, many more, and there are more that we could name here today. So think of those and just generally think about how that affects your ability to go about life if you have no access to any of those things.
Okay, so different, if they did get a job, you know, so like, they taking the court costs out of their paycheck, is it like a monthly payment, or are they taking like the whole paycheck?
Generally, there are laws that say it has to be like, it can't be more than a certain percent of the paycheck. But you have to also consider that maybe they might be garnishing from multiple different slots. So if your paycheck is being garnished, it can be garnished by any government agency. Let's say you owe on child support for all different children, that's all gonna get garnished. It'll be a portion of it. So you may only get back, any individual who has I believe now 7 children. I believe now 7, and was very frustrated after receiving a check, after all of his child support payments had been out, income garnished, they only left like $100, like $1,000 paid up. So, like, you can get pretty much nothing back if your paycheck's been garnished in a substantial amount, depending on what is being garnished.
Yeah, I noticed that I have 4 kids. You check me on $8 less on the child support.
So if you're in that situation, does it seem like it's a great idea to work where taxes get taken out of your check? Or does it seem like finding some work, whatever it is, under disabling cash would be a better option for you? And
What about if a person is on disability, could the government? like,
yes,
Garnish disability
yes,
checks,
you can garnish disability.
so they couldn't take that with them.
The government, generally speaking, the government can do it once. There's actually a legal theory for this called eminent domain, which means if they want it, they get it. We'll talk about that later. I'll wait a minute. But those are 3 examples. Any questions about that and complete process? No? Okay. All right. Who is the criminal black man? And describe what Michelle Alexander means when using this phrase to describe certain populations. We referenced this person earlier. We were talking about the social caste, the racial caste, excuse me. So what does it mean to say, what is the concept of a criminal black man?
So it's the racial stereotype that like they're automatically seen and feels basically every part of law enforcement reporting, automatically seen guilty, even if there's no criminal history, no matter their economic status, education status, it's automatically seen guilty. And that's gonna lead to like strict reporting practices like traffic stops. You know, officers are going to be on edge.
Absolutely. That is what it means to be the criminal black man. If we're still referencing or still using our social and racial caste conversation, they are in this country the racial caste version of an untouchable. It's someone who's born into that. That's their identity. That's, and Michelle Alexander, I think, is very smart in the way that she pushes all those words together. Criminal black man, becomes all one word, all one identity. Doesn't matter that the crime or like the fact that they were born male and identified as black came way before any crime commitments or anything else. Doesn't matter. They lump it all together because once you are born into that identity, let's say because your parent did, like I said, you have family history. Even if you have no criminal history, what if your family does or your brothers do? That was a big problem when I was a juvenile. Every time they went to lock up a young kid, I guarantee you he had a brother who had a case in the adult system. Guaranteed. And they already saw him as guilty, no matter what this young child was. Oh, he's got a brother. His brother's in this such and such gang. Okay, there's no evidence for that. But that's what they see. That's the idea, the concept of a criminal black man. That person who was born into a caste. And like Wesley said, no matter who sees them, who views them, whether that's the judge, the prosecutor, the public, their friends and family sometimes, because again, these ideas have been so internalized by all of us as society, we see them as criminal black men. People who can never leave that mentality behind. People are always going to be in the streets. People are always going to be hustling. People are always going to be doing this or that. That's what Michelle Alexander is talking about. Even their friends and family, again, through that social conditioning process, see them, label them, and will not let them move from that identity. No matter what. So how does it work to contribute to mass incarceration? As Leslie said, if we see the person that way, and a police sees them when they pull over, that's more likely to lead to a search. That's more likely to lead to an imprisonment, more likely to lead to a secondary imprisonment, more likely to lead to you losing all of your civil rights. And then we were at a point where we're like, at 3 strikes, you're out. And now we have mass incarceration. It just becomes a snowball effect. Very much from the second this person is born and given this identity or given this label, no matter how it came to be, whether it's because they inherited it by association or because at an early point in their life they engaged in a socially undesirable behavior and were they labeled as such at a very young age, or they just at a very young age didn't conform to society's expectations or couldn't conform to society's expectations. They got this label, they're never able to escape it, and it becomes a snowball system, especially when we consider how many young Black men are susceptible to this label. And when that's true, again, snowball effect happens all throughout the criminal legal system, and that ends us in mass incarceration. Any questions about that? Looks like you have one on your face, Nathan, so I want to make sure. And then I see one at the back, so that's okay. Well, I've got one at the back, so wait for that one, we'll come back, let's go.
Could you? Why, like,
Yes, you absolutely can, because civil ex forfeiture are also in place. So if the criminal black man accumulates a lot through whatever deeds that he has, what are we gonna do with that? Are we gonna let him keep it? No, civil forfeiture is there to make sure you don't keep it. No matter how you got your names, you don't get it. You don't get to move up the ladder. We'll take it all from you, no matter how you got it. Nathan?
Okay, with the juvenile record, is it still supposedly at the age of 18?
Great question. Is the juvenile record still at the age of 18?
Well,
it's
that's
sealed, but
that's a
it's,
follow-up question.
You're okay.
it's sealed, but it can be released under the parent's consent.
True, it can also be released under the individual's consent, and the arrest, no matter what age it occurred, is always available to law enforcement or law enforcement adjacent bodies, meaning a prosecutor, a judge, a police officer, can always tell if you have a juvenile history. Nobody else may be able to tell, it may not be publicly available anywhere else. But the people who really fucking matter, if that knows who you have, if you have a juvenile history, they're gonna know. It's not sealed with them.
So if the person committed a crime as a juvenile and as they get older, then they have a family court issue or whatever, and then it's a small town, okay? I just know somebody who's established it.
Yeah.
And the lawyer was the guy's representative in the felony case, and the chancellor was his wife. But anyway, it was like a bias.
Absolutely,
Because.
that's a conflict of interest.
Exactly, but
Yeah.
so does it matter when you were talking about ethical prosecution or prosecutor? Does the size of the town matter or? Does it-
Absolutely it does. Absolutely it does. If you know that you're the prosecutor and you know the defendant, and you don't recuse yourself and say, I understand that this is a small town, that's not justice. Is that justice if you know that? And now you're advocating for them to go to jail or prison or whatever? Absolutely not. You should absolutely recuse yourself. That's literally the reason that we're all trying to get Clarence Thomas off the Supreme Court. He didn't tell any of us that he was taking hundreds of thousands of dollars and trips and money and gifts from all these people who presented in court in front of him and then ruled in their favor. That is what the law calls a conflict of interest. You are not supposed to know anybody, even if you knew it only existed at juvenile. That means you have information about that person that can bias your objective viewing of the case, which means you gotta get off it. If I was a defense attorney, that would be the same thing. If I knew the victim, I'm out. And it's not even just necessarily that I feel bad for the victim. There was a case, this happens a lot at the public defender's office, because the saying, hurt people, super true. Which means that most of the time, who are our victims and our defendants? Not very much, sometimes on different cases, it just depends. And there was a situation in which I got a case, or excuse me, my coworker Nina got a case in juvenile, and a witness, complaining witness, the person who called 911 and the person who talked to police and showed up was a person she had previously represented when she first started being a lawyer. That's a conflict of interest, should immediately get off it. That witness is actually favorable to us, it was favorable to the defendant. They were best friends since they'd been dating, they were best friends, they'd been rolling around together, and she refused to snitch on him. He later became my client, that's how I know that was the case. He's actually like my foster kid now, so it was at the time ridiculous that we had to treat this as a conflict of interest because he and the girl were friends. They still knew each other. She was still calling him in jail. We had to have a conversation about not that because the police are listening and can record this. She's a witness in your case, so witness tampering, please don't do that. But he didn't understand that because they knew each other. But yes, that was absolutely. My friend Nina had to get off the case simply because she knew the witness that had previously represented them. Yes, they were going to be, she was not going to be saying anything negative about this witness. She was actually going to be endorsing that witness, but still a conflict of interest. You gotta get off the case. And that was as the defense attorney. So the prosecutor, no matter how small the town is, says, I know I'm aware of the defendant, we've had a history, and I knew some things about them, but I can still be fair and impartial. You were the defendant. You know that.
And can you like file some with the ADA for
Yes.
professional responsibility?
Yes, you can. You can file with every bar association that they have violated the professional ethical obligation. And if the ABA reviews it and believes that it has done, they will conduct an investigation. Attorneys can get sanctioned and can lose their license. Yes, they can. Absolutely. Absolutely, and those are the cases in which they're most likely to lose their license, in which they did not display it, or they actively report on a conflict of interest, especially in a criminal case. There's a conflict of interest in a criminal case, even judges get away with it, they will refuse themselves and say, I don't want it. This happened in my neighborhood, I've seen a judge say, look, this happened in my neighborhood, I'm so sick of carjackings. Said nothing to do with you, sir, but I'm really sick of carjackings in my neighborhood, so I'm accusing myself because I know I'm too biased. That is what you're supposed to do. So that's ethical. That's what ethics require us to do in the law. All right, the last one. What is the bird cage as described by Michelle Alexander, and how does it work to contribute to mass incarceration? Yes.
I just want to ask, the bird cage like the crazy that the people are putting into.
Oh, it's sort of close. More metaphorical.
She said that, Michelle said that it's like a structural arrangement that locks a racially distinct group in subordinate political, social, and economic position. He basically mentions like when, she basically mentioned that when prison black males can be discriminated against legally the rest of their lives, like not employment, housing, education, public benefits, and they will be unable to surmount those obstacles. And because of facing them obstacles, like most men will eventually return to prison and then be released, close circle of, yeah. So basically like a trap.
Right from the top of the bird cage, right? Little wire things. Trying to think of another word.
What about she not informed the audience that like any given wire of the cage may or may not be specifically developed to trap the bird. Like it still operates together with the other wires to restrict its freedom.
Banging answers, but we've got this for your mission. So I may want to elaborate a little bit more, but you're 100% on target. So the metaphor of the bird cage, and the importance of it is what the sentence that you just said last said. None of these individual wires would trap somebody necessarily. But when you have the intersection of a judicial system that's not prepared to help you, of racism, of occupational limitation and money, of educational opportunity, of family history and or trauma. None of those are singularly created or singularly function to trap even the criminal black man or the person into the cage of mass incarceration. But what they all do when they intersect is create that cage and make it absolutely impossible for them to leave. So that's what I'm talking about when I say describe what the wires mean. The wires of the cage are the individual circumstances that a person must overcome and face. We all have them. They all may be different for different individuals, but we all have them. And as long as we can work to eliminate some, so like in my personal life, I don't necessarily face racism. We'll make this one about me. Sexism. Homophobia. Let's just remember the words on the other ones. This is mine, right? All of them together, I'm pretty trapped. I can't really move anywhere. But if I have educational opportunity, which I do, they went to school, I was able to eliminate there. I was able to eliminate that. That got me a pretty big gap, right? Because of my education, I was able to make more money. That's a pretty big gap, right? If we can address structural sexism, we haven't, but assuming that we have, or we did, that would leave a pretty big gap for me to get out and fly, right? So the birdcage function is there, or explains how these individual things come together to create a system where you cannot escape. And they're not individually designed to do that necessarily. Sometimes Jeffrey, what we talked about earlier in question one, he would argue some of them actually were, the judicial system, in particular. But like, if you're getting a history of trauma, one of the time to keep you in your spot, right? It's the things that happen. But if you can address something like that through, I don't know, therapy and rehabilitation, might that give you a window to escape? So that's the bird statement. Each of these wires is a part of the system. The bigger social system, not just the criminal legal system, but as a part of the system. And individually, they don't necessarily refrain someone. But the more wires that a person encounters, and the more that they intersect, the less likely it is that person can escape. Just like a bird cage. What'd you say about the door? This is great. Go ahead. Mm-hmm. Right? What's true about the block? What's true about the door? Okay, who owns pets? What happens when you leave the kennel, cage, door unlocked?
Some escape, but others still sits there. Like.
So true. And I think that is a great analogy for what you just said. Some will just sit there, believing that the door being closed is enough. There will be a few brave ones. Mine's name are Luna and Leia. Who are like, all right, let's try it, see how far we can get. Sometimes the answer is all the way down to the church at the end of the street. Sorry, we had an issue this weekend. And they're gonna go for it. And they might actually escape. But do we think that that's going to be enough? Or do we not just throw them right back in and lock the door? The door is an illusion that gives you the impression. It's the pull yourself up by your bootstraps mentality that we have in this country. It's that belief that if you just work hard enough, you just try hard enough, you can get through the door. Anyone can get through the door. It has hinges, it has an opening. You can do it, right? That door is locked. Does it mean anything at all that there's a door there? So, love that you have that, because that is an additional part of the metaphor. The door is illusory. It is there to make you think that you can, when what's really going to change is these wires. If we really change things, we change the wires, there would be no reason for that door to be there. No need for the illusion if we change the wire. Got rid of the wires, right? Other questions, comments on this? Excellent. All right, now let's get your choice answer. Essay. All right, on this particular one, I'm assuming no one did one because this one is also about Chronicle of Racism, and you guys didn't read that or didn't watch that, right? So you did. Okay, great. We'll talk a little bit about. He makes the claim that America was founded on white supremacy. What does he mean, and what evidence can be found in the legal system? Be specific with your examples. What does it mean to say America was founded on white supremacy? And Paul and Nathan first, send you answer this question, and then the rest of the class is taken.
After this very much, the thought of white supremacy being involved in the founding of the United States is clear to me at first, looking furthermore on this road.
Oh, so yeah, you don't have to give me your essay. You can just
Yeah,
give me
that's
your.
what I'm trying to skip to. 16, 19, 20 plus people were brought to America, landed in Jamestown. Was the beginning because in 1636, their slave ship was launched, aptly named the Desire.
Isn't that interesting?
And
50
it was
years.
named after like.
Yeah. They were all named after fortune. They were carrying human beings, and they were named after fortune. Keep on named.
Continues at 1662, Virginia passed a law making child of an enslaved mother enslaved child.
Which means you can't escape, right? We have a caste system. If you are born to this person, you will die as an enslaved person. Period. That's a great example. Yes, thank you. Please go on.
1740, a 53-page law was passed after a violent rebellion in Stono, South Carolina, where some white people were beheaded. That read, so that the slave may be kept in 2 subjugations. Once again, this was the law. I was in 20 South Carolina. So it was a very
But yes, the government was literally set up and designed on white supremacy. And you cannot say that without recognizing the real history. So Jeffrey also talks about other instances that I'll give you some examples of. He talks about how reparations have actually been paid. Did anybody know that reparations have been paid? Yeah, who knows who got the reparations? The slave owners. That was part of the Emancipation Proclamation. Everybody thinks Abraham Lincoln so honest and freed the slaves because he's a good person. No, he freed the slaves to end the war because he wasn't, no one in the Union was happy with him because he had been in slavery already. In the South, he already lost the South. So what did he need to do? He needed to unify the country. This is a way that he could unify the country and also make it clear what their policy decision was. At the same time, he didn't want to piss off the wealthy white people who were still technically part of the Union and had to secede again. So what did he do? He makes it federal legislation that for every single person that they lost to freedom, cannot make this up, the government would reimburse them. And that money today would be worth billions of dollars in how much the government gave out to white slave owners who had their slaves. You don't think that's white supremacy at work or in the law? Don't know how else to convince you. Yes, they did.
This law, which
The
is
3/5 law.
still-
That's literally our Constitution and the entire existence of the Electoral College. Why did they exist? Why did the Southern colonies and who would become states want this? Without the 3/5 compromise, they wouldn't have nearly as much representation as the North. It wasn't nearly as populated. But they didn't want to they didn't want to acknowledge that these individuals were people and citizens, because then that would give them rights to vote and they might lose what they had built. So let's treat them as 3/5 of a person, and that will solve all the problems. You can get them for representation that makes the slave owners happy, but they're not citizens, so the slave owners are still. That's in our Constitution. And now when we see our Constitution, it's like beautiful, beautiful language. And what people will do will just do this. As if that somehow erases the significance that it was to call in a government document other people not human, not civil. So there are lots of other examples of this that Jeffrey talks about in that documentary. So if you answer that question, great. Those are some of the ones that I want to talk to you. That's what I love talking about. I want you to then kind of explain and explore how that concept of that very kind of or that kind of seed that's planted then continues throughout, and we see that. And that's kind of what Jeffrey does. He talks about the seed that's planted with all these beginning laws and then traces them through time, through Jim Crow, through separate but equal, through, or separate but equal first. Jim Crow, separate but equal, civil rights movements, and up into Black Lives Matter. He traces it through all of those movements to show what they're kind of doing. So that's when you answer. Sounded like to start off with a great start, Nathan, so I'm not sure I'm changing very much, but for the rest of you, any questions? Okay. All right. Throughout the course, specifically when we talked about specifically in Jeffrey's Robinson's documentary, Who We Are, and in a couple of the readings, we discussed a couple of historical events that were viewed differently: social, political, racial, ethnic, and even cultural groups. I wanted 3 examples of such historical events and explain how they different groups viewed events and discuss the significance of each perspective. You might know what I'm talking about. I know Jen, you might have a hint, Nathan, because there were a couple mentioned in the DVD, or excuse me, in the video. But if not, I'll help you guys out a lot with this one. So there are several instances that Michelle Alexander, oh, go ahead. You have okay. And there are several instances in which certain things might have been phrased differently. Tell me, those of you who remember any history that you learned in your lower stages, like elementary school, middle school, about something called the Black Tulsa riots. Anybody remember that? How about? Yes, see? So certain groups, depending on where you were raised or what family members you have, or who might have been giving you your history lessons. Where I grew up in a very agricultural place in the middle of Tennessee, where, the population of my county, my spouse has looked this up before because he hates going back. My spouse is from Memphis and he hates going back to my family's house. Because if you look this up to prove the point to me, that 98% of the county is white. 98%. So do you think when I heard about that particular historical event that I heard it called the Black Wall Street Massacre? No, I did not. I heard it called the Black or the Tulsa riots, where people were just rioting in the streets and the government had to come in and shut it down. What actually happened at Black Wall Street Massacre?
Well, what I did,
Mhm.
things was the other day, and I don't know what exactly happened in the matter, but it was, my husband on the street playing that a smoke was in up there, and the white residents outside of Black Wall Street, which Black Wall Street was, predominantly black, actually, had their own doctors, lawyers.
It was the highest concentration of Black wealth that existed in the United States at the time.
And they just went to find him, but they didn't just beat him, they killed multiple, like
Hundreds.
hundreds, almost.
So many people. It's very bloody. But depending on who you are and how you learned, or how you went to school, or where you went to school, you hear those things differently. People of color hear those stories passed down through their families, and they hear them called the Black Wall Street Massacre. I didn't have any family of color. I only heard about this incident because I learned about it in school from a textbook approved by a very, very white legislature. Hello, all the currently banned drag still. So that's the kind of people who were informing my textbook, which definitely told me that it was a riot. So I grew up believing this is a riot. But people grew up knowing that it was a massacre. And that matters when we're trying to come together on how to solve issues of race, of disparity, of criminal legal problems. If we don't fundamentally understand that the events that we're talking about are the same events, they're just viewed through a different lens. Because what's true of history? What? It does repeat itself, and what else? Who writes history? The victors. To the victor go the spoils of war. History is written by the victors. Legislatures approve the textbooks. So if they're writing the story, are they going to include the narrative that this is actually just a very, very, very wealthy area surrounded by a lot of impoverished whiteness, and that an offense, a perceived offense on a white person, created a massacre of the wealthiest Black people in the country? No, we're not gonna, the government's not gonna call that. It would be government sanctioned violence, and we're not okay with that. Right? Right? No, so there are several other examples that we talked about in New Jim Crow and in Jeffrey Robinson. So I wanted you to come up with 3 of those, and then generally do what we just did, discuss how having those 2 different or more than one opinions ultimately matter when we're trying to solve these problems. The significance of each perspective, right? One cultural group with respect to this particular issue, one cultural group uses it as a massacre of its people, a massacre of a sacred place. This is the only place in the United States where people were proliferating in that amount by that much at all. Not necessarily a holy place, but certainly a place that showed what it could be to be free in America for a Black person, right? Versus how all the white kids were raised to believe that this was a riot on after somebody assaulted us. Why would they do that? Why would people treat us that way?
To make it seem just, make it seem like it's right.
Right, to make it seem just, how could you justify the slaughter of that many people, right? Slaughter. All right, so once you discuss those, then explain the rules of the game. We do not have time to do that for that one, so I'm gonna pause for a second. We might talk about that one at the beginning of next class. Because the rules of the game, actually, there is a great, I have it on Canvas, there is a really great, like 9 condenses the material into just a couple things. I'll share it via PDF, and you guys can have that and use that. The rules of the game are essentially the way the Supreme Court has chipped away at your constitutional right. Go ahead.
So in the rule of the game, is considered like, the rules that need to constrain the police.
So I wanted you to give me some of the rules. Rules would have been the Fourth Amendment. If you did not talk about the Fourth Amendment in this question, you are nowhere on the right page. So go back and rewrite it. It's all based on the Fourth Amendment. And then all the exceptions that are listed that we know from Jim Crow. So New Jim Crow specifically talks about very specific ones, like ones to do with automobiles. Ones to do with civil forfeiture. Do you have your hand back up? Oh, somebody. Forfeiture. Search and seizure law. Incrimination. And then even at the very end, in Batson, which is jury selection. So it's all these rules that essentially, not all of them are necessarily tied to the Fourth Amendment, but this is where it starts. Because for mass incarceration, we're talking about drug offenses, which is pretty much the Fourth Amendment. Straightforward. But the rules of the game, that particular chapter goes through the Fourth Amendment, and then all these exceptions that, as you very eloquently stated, when put together, really undermine and create almost an entirely new game. We think that the game we're playing is the law that we talked about earlier, right? That's the law, we're given, it's pretty, it's set in stone, it's black and white. The living is the reality, it's the rules of the game. It's how the Supreme Court has created essentially more room for law enforcement action and participation under the Fourth Amendment by expanding it. Those are the new rules of the game. And how do we survive in era of mass incarceration with these new rules of the game? That's kind of the point of that chapter. And again, I have a Taylor, will you remind me to send PDF of rules of game or post PDF of rules of game to Candace? All right, so that's what I want you to do. There's a PDF on that one. We can spend more time if you want to talk about it more in the next classes or open time we can. It's just that one would be a long answer. I expect a lot on that one. If you do well on that one though, most of all three of my top 8 answers selected, I think that one did a great job. So you want that review PDF? We'll talk a little bit. So talk to the next one. Michelle Alexander argues that mass incarceration has been hugely influenced by the Supreme Court of the United States. Specifically, she argues there's been a 2-step process implemented by the court. The opinion, which effectively rubber stamps the war on drugs. What are the 2 steps and how do they contribute to the war on drugs and mass incarceration? We should provide examples. Who can tell me the 2 steps?
Stop this.
All right, so this is an entire chapter on in Michelle Alexander as well. She has these very 2 specific steps. The first step are the roundup, so how police go about rounding up people and collecting them in the burn cage, so to speak. And then the lockdown. So those are 2 parts. They have more subparts. And then I would want you to explain how they contribute to the lockdown. First, determine the group of people the government wants to control. We did that in the war on drugs. Who was it? Or Black people, correct. Guys, the Nixon administration literally released the papers that said, all you have to do is get people to conflate hippies and marijuana and Black men with crime. And that's how you solve all the problems. Literally documents of Nixon and his advisors saying this. So, yes. First, determine the group of people that the government wants to control. If we do that, check. We did that in the Constitution. We didn't even give them citizenship, names, or identities. Secondly, argue the Supreme Court that certain specific constitutional language, like things like probable cause and warrant searches, need to be broadened to help law enforcement protect the public from the public health crisis of the war on drugs. Which makes sense, right? If we're dealing with a public health crisis, instead of letting doctors control it, we let police officers control it, right? Then test the limits of this newfound authority by engaging in things like correctly identified gossip, stop and frisk, and consensual searches and seizures. Because if you have consent, or you're just allowed to stop and frisk, we can get a lot more done, can't we? Law enforcement can get really, really far if they just ask you, hey, we just search. Question. Police officer asks any of you at this given moment, if you could submit to a search, how many of you would say yes solely by intimidation? Be honest. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Yeah. Jalen's back there with me, like, no. That's just, I rest a lot on my white privilege and my education and my law degree when I engage with police. I do not encourage anyone to do that. Myself, it drives him nuts. He hates when we get pulled over because I will not be nice to him. I will act like you inconvenience me and you ruin my day because you can. I don't think you deserve niceness just because you have a badge. There are people who act like that, and then there are people who don't, and most of us are people who don't, right? We see a police officer, they have the badge, they have the authority, there's a gun on their hip that you cannot miss. There's handcuffs on the other side, there's probably a bully stick somewhere around there, there might be a Kevlar vest on, and they are in a car, they might have a dog in that car. Do you feel safe to say, no, I don't, fuck off, I don't care? No, you don't. Even those of you who don't want to raise your hand right now, you don't, okay? I know you don't.
It depends on if the person's driving dirty or not. You know, I mean, because I tell my wife all the time, you know, I hope when I get pulled over, something else, like, just to do it, you know, because I've never had to do it.
I tell them no all the time. I love saying that. It's my favorite because I know that I can. I know I can get away with it. Is that available to every person? Is that reality or even that peace of mind available to every person? Absolutely it is not. Even if nothing were going to happen, we could flash forward and tell that nothing was going to happen. Could you convince a person who's had negative interactions or families had negative interactions that nothing bad is going to happen? Just say yes. That's terrifying. So the concept of consent is super important by allowing essentially officers to say like, they consented, and we don't have to tell them that they don't have to. Unlike in Miranda, where you have to tell them you have the right not to talk. We don't car officers just say you can say no to me. Can you imagine how much that would cut down on? I would say that I would tell my last class this, about 80% of the evidence that was found in my cases was found by consent. People don't know they can say no. And unlike statements, we don't require the police to tell them you can't say that. David.
I just wanted to piggyback on what you were saying. One time I got pulled over in Department. He came with my car and he was talking to me. And I said, why are you pulling me over for? And he said that I was speeding. I said, well, I just got on the street. I only going 20 miles here.
Yeah.
And then he didn't ask my ID, my insurance. He just started like questioning me. And I really was knowing. I was playing along. And I said, sir, you need anything? He did his part and he did like this. He was like, you just go have a nice day. But it was asking a question that was like random, like my birthday and when did I get my car and who bought the car. I guess things that criminal like to like put you in that time frame, like give them consent. But
I just say yes.
Yeah.
If I just keep this conversation going, if I just make people say no, or if I just chat with people, say yes. So that's all part of the roundup. We're getting people involved. We're getting more people in it. The second part is the lockdown, which has 3 more parts. First, arrest them. Instead of just letting them come and go in these interactions, take them into custody. Found something, you can find something, take them into custody. We'll make it up. Fifth, scare the target group with additional criminal charges whose punishment is very real, right? You can jack up charges. It's very, very easy, especially in drug cases. Especially with like weed, like felony weed. And you can say, hey, we're going to charge you with distribution because it weighs this much and it was packaged in individual baggies. And you might say, fine for a significant amount of time because it is cheaper if you buy in bulk, sir. If you do anything about drugs, you would know that. So, no, it's not distribution, but is the punishment for distribution very real? And can they convince a jury that because it was in individual baggies and you had it on you, that you were going to sell it? And doesn't it then require you to get on the stand and say, yes, the weed was mine, but I wasn't planning on selling it. I wasn't going to distribute it. I just bought it in bulk because it's cheaper. Now, you might get some juries who would do that, but are you guaranteed that jury? Also, are they guaranteed to believe that you owned it but didn't plan to sell it? Because you could be like, yeah, I'll plead possession, but that's how you can use that situation to scare the target group with additional charges. They know, well, I got you on his possession, but can they scare you into pleading to possession because they can tempt you with, or they can scare you with distribution?
Like my father-in-law, before I married my husband, when he was in high school, they had went to Walmart and he got some like Sudafed for allergies or something. And they called the police on him, I guess, because he had bought what they deemed was too much. So they followed him home
sat in his driveway and was questioning him, like, why did you buy this much? What are you gonna do with it? Like, the whitest man ever, too. He like, I just have allergies, like, I don't, like,
Right.
what do you want me to do? And they scare you with thinking that that's going to be, that's unreasonable to the crime, again, to coerce you into doing something you wouldn't otherwise do. Usually in this case, plead guilty. Last part, because I know we're running out of time. 6, lock them up, put them in the bird cage, and when they are released, create circumstances that make it difficult, if not impossible, for them to re-enter society as a free man. Have we not done that by eradicating all of their civil rights and removing privileges and removing things they qualify for? We absolutely have. Now the last one was explain the legal significance of Batson versus Kentucky. That is a jury challenge. If you have answered that question, again, we're gonna save that and potentially rules for the game for Wednesday. If you want. Okay, here's what else we're going to do. Briefly, I'm gonna stop recording because this doesn't need to get recorded.